Here we are with our final plant list of the semester. We're going to have 10 more plants, and they will all be trees this time. And in choosing these final 10 plants, it's perhaps more a choice of what not to cover than what to actually cover. So by the end of this semester, we will have covered 80 plants. That's quite a few. But as you are starting to look around with more fine tuned vision, you're probably aware that there's so much more that you have yet to learn. And so there's many more plants that you will learn on your journey as a plant person, a horticulturist, gardener in this field. We can only kind of get you started here in this class. So hopefully some of the techniques we've covered on how to memorize, how to learn, how to review, what to observe, different patterns in plants and categories, and how to think about how they're related, and what to identify when you're looking at plant species. Hopefully, you've taken all this and can then apply it to your future knowledge. In many ways, this is just the beginning. But here we go with plant list 4B and simply calling it trees. The first one on our list is Areobatria difflexa, the bronze loquat. We've had the regular loquat, the edible loquat, Areobatria japonica, and this one is an ornamental loquat. Notice the similarity in the leaf shape, but the young leaves of the bronze loquat are bronze or kind of a reddish color. So this small tree is planted as an ornamental, climate appropriate, just like our standard loquat, and can add a little bit of variety in the landscape. I had a former student once say that the way they remember it is deflexa can deflect like the bronze shield. So bronze loquat, they pictured a shield, a bronze shield, metal shield, and that shield is used to deflect arrows or something like that. So they linked Areobatria deflexa to the bronze loquat. You can see in the image showing the blossoms of the bronze loquat. They are blooming this time of year in late spring and early summer. They are evergreen, they do not lose their leaves, but they do provide year round interest. They're very tidy. This makes them good for patio trees. They could possibly be grown in large containers, and they would be fine close to swimming pools and water features because they don't drop a lot of leaf throughout the year. Remember, small trees are good under power lines. They're appropriate for staying small and not growing up into the power lines. And they're also good as street trees. And these ones are fire wise as well. They won't increase your fire risk. Ultimately, it is an attractive, ornamental, small tree, good for a Southern California landscape, and can add some unique variety as well as year round interest. So here we have Areobatria difflexa, bronze loquat. And next up we have Eucalyptus cladocalyx sugar gum. This is a very large eucalyptus tree. There are hundreds of species of eucalyptus, and many of them grow here in San Diego. They can be a little bit tricky to identify and differentiate. But one of the most common large eucalyptus trees that we plant is the sugar gum. All eucalyptus trees can commonly be referred to as gum tree, and sugar gum is identifiable because, first of all, it's large size. Second of all, it has a reddish tone to the leaves, in particular, the new leaves. You can see the image on the left showing a red midrib or the vein of the leaf. The center vein is red, but you can also see that new growth on the tips, the growing tips of the branches is bright red. So when you look at this tree in certain seasons, you will observe kind of a reddish brown or a rusty red color. The other way to recognize this plant is that it has a smooth bark, and that texture is smooth, but it's very mottled. And you'll get white, gray, orange, and brown, kind of in a patchwork or just a mottled color on a smooth texture. And then finally, you look at the overall size. This is a huge tree, very tall, over 100 feet tall. We see them in older landscapes and along the sides of the freeways. And when you observe this tree, it has quite a distinct profile. The branches are all upward facing, and the leaves appear to be in clusters, kind of like a cloud. And typically, the branching happens at a 50% height. So your first set of branches takes place about halfway up the tree, and then it goes another 50% of the branch and will split again. And so you get this relatively unique, upright, slender, but very tall growth habit. Eucalyptus were introduced into Southern California in the 1800s, and primarily they were planted as a timber plant in order to grow wood that could be used for construction. They grow really well here in San Diego because South Australia is a similar climate to here, although they like a bit more rainfall than we get in San Diego. So they grow best where it rains more, but they can tolerate low rainfall. When they grow in low rainfall areas, they tend to remove the moisture from the soil faster than it can be put in to the ground with rain. So these plants have the effect of dehydrating the landscape. That's typically not a good thing and can be problematic for fire prone areas like San Diego. And it can be difficult for other plants to be established under the eucalyptus, not just for the dry soil effect, but also because there's a chemical that is exuded through the roots of this tree that inhibits the growth of most other types of plants. Acacia is one notable exception that can typically do well underneath eucalyptus trees. So they were planted here to form wood for construction, mainly the timber that would be used in the railroads that went north and south all along California. However, when you grow eucalyptus in dry climates, the wood is not as valuable. It's not as good. It does not grow straight and it's not as hard. It twists and it breaks, and it's kind of a weaker wood in a dry climate than it is in its native climate where it's a bit more wet. So the best places to grow eucalyptus are in Northern California, where they truly are more invasive than in Southern California, and in the rainy parts of Australia, and believe it or not, Brazil, Hawaii, some of our tropical climates are places where eucalyptus is grown as a plantation to produce lumber or wood for construction. So all of these plants were introduced. They turned out to not be very good. And at the same time, California was cutting down the redwood forest in order to access the limestone that was needed in order to make the sidewalks and pavement and concrete of the buildings that were being put in, primarily San Francisco at the time and Los Angeles. So they were already cutting down redwoods and they had them. And so that's why redwood trees became the railroad ties. And so it's kind of a sad history. They didn't have good ecological awareness. They introduced an invasive species for a useful purpose, and they cut down a native species instead because it was just being thrown away. And so we messed up there as humans. Now there's a trend to get rid of all eucalyptus. Wherever you see it, let's cut it down, let's remove it, let's treat it like it's an enemy. But I think that's also a mistake. There are ecological benefits to all living things, and if you're going to remove something, you better encourage other plants to grow in its place, because this tree, even though it does have some negative environmental consequences, it provides shade. It does provide humidity to the atmosphere. It blocks the wind. It is habitat for nesting birds. In particular, large birds, raptors like to be in this tree. And so there's some times when it may be appropriate, maybe not planting too many new ones, but the ones we've got, maybe we should hang on to them. Eucalyptus trees are prone to dropping limbs in high wind and in low wind environments. So the wind can blow down branches if it's strong enough, especially with these narrow branch angles. It creates a weak attachment. But also in points of low wind, if the air is not moving at all, the humidity coming out of these trees can build up around the leaf and actually kind of get rid of the water pressure that holds up the tree. And when that happens, you have sudden limb drop. Usually in the summertime when it's hot, there's a lot of transpiration and there's no wind moving. So you do want to watch out for these trees. When they're planted right next to streets or sidewalks, there is some hazard associated. Eucalyptus cladocalyx is one of the most common eucalyptus that you see, and it's not necessarily an invasive species. It's good to be able to identify it, and I think there is a place for it in some of our well-established landscapes, and it has a historical value as well as an ecological value. But in newly planted areas, I would never recommend it. It is not a low water use tree. Even though you don't need to irrigate it, it will consume a lot of water. In fact, this tree is planted sometimes in order to lower the water table in marshy areas if you want to build on top of them. But nowadays, we don't typically want to do that. And so I appreciate them while they're here, and they may be ones that are no longer encouraged in the future. Here we have Eucalyptus cladocalyx sugar gum. And next up, we have a second eucalyptus species that we will cover. This is Eucalyptus Citroxylon red ironbark. Notice how different this eucalyptus looks primarily. It's dark in color, very almost black colored bark. And notice how the texture of the trunk is not smooth. It's deeply ridged. And the stems are red with a bluish green leaf. And when this blooms, it'll have bright pink or bright red blossoms. This eucalyptus is much smaller than the sugar gum, but potentially more problematic. It as well does not tend to become invasive in our area, but it does have the issue of burning at a very high temperature. And so even firefighters commonly call this the gasoline tree, because when wildfire comes into a red ironbark forest, these trees, which retain eucalyptus oil, which is flammable, they get hot enough that they basically explode. They kind of combust. And so they will catch fire relatively easily. They will take a ground fire, which is usually not a problem, up to a canopy, a crown fire, which is dangerous. So they act as a fuel ladder, which is something you don't want. And they burn very hot. And so nowadays, you don't have many recommendations to plant them. But again, I think they do have an ornamental value, an aesthetic function, maybe in areas where fire is not as much of a risk and you already have them established. They could be maintained in a way that's not going to be too problematic. There are some other species of eucalyptus that are much worse to have in our area. And for the most part, we've gotten rid of them. And we've also stopped them from being sold in the nurseries. The two that I present here are not really ecological problems to the extent that many people think they are. They can be planted in the wrong place and they can pose a fire risk, however. So they would need to be managed in a way that minimizes that fire risk. As I said, in urban landscapes that are well established, there is not as much of a risk. So here we have Eucalyptus Citroxylon, red iron bark. And next up, we've got another Australian tree. This is Gaijira parviflora, Australian willow. This tree is a good alternative to a true willow. It's not a willow in the strict sense, which is one that would not be drought tolerant. This is a drought tolerant tree from Australia, and it looks like a willow because it has a weeping growth habit with long, slender leaves. So it gives you that weeping habit without consuming a bunch of water. This is a medium-sized tree. It'll get to 40, 50 feet tall maximum, but it takes a long time for it to get that size. Commonly, we see them 25 to 35 feet. They're great street trees. They're evergreen. They will drop some leaf litter over time, gradually, bit by bit, but they can be kept tidy. They're easy to prune, and they are very hardy and drought tolerant. There is one drawback to this tree that many people don't mention, and maybe you don't know about it unless you've been under it for every day of a year. Do you see the flowers on the left-hand side? Those flowers are pollinated by flies. So every flower is co-evolved with certain pollinators, and some are only pollinated by one type of organism. Flies are the primary pollinator of this tree. What do flies like? They like rotting fruits and vegetables and rotting meat. So the smell of rotting meat attracts the flies. So what do these flowers smell like? They smell like rotting flesh. They only flower once a year for about 3 weeks. So you will get a odd smell that is very unpleasant, but it's not so strong that you can always place it. You kind of walk next to it or you are sitting under it and then you look around, what is that smell? Where is that coming from? It's coming from the tree. These flowers, they smell bad. It's in order to attract the fly pollinator. Most of the year, there's no flowers. So I still feel very comfortable having this tree close to a living space. Some people, however, may be more sensitive than others, and it may be something you want to consider. I think it's kind of interesting, fascinating. I don't know that it would increase the flies coming into a property or into a place where humans are. And I think it adds to an all around biodiversity of a landscape. But it would be something that you'd want to consider. Maybe don't plant it as a windbreak because once a year you'd get some wind coming through this tree that smells pretty bad. It's in the rue family, which is the same family as citrus trees. And when you crush the leaves of this tree, you get a citrus fragrance. So maybe there's some pleasant fragrance to make up for the foul odor of the flowers. All around, I think it's a wonderful little tree. It's great to incorporate in your landscape. It gives a nice ornamental effect. There are some unique environmental benefits as well as this characteristic of being a fly pollinated tree. One way or another, it's well worth our consideration. It's climate appropriate and very hardy and very well behaved in an urban landscape. So this is Gaijira parviflora, Australian willow. And next up, we have Grevilia robusta, the silk oak. People call this silk oak, silky oak, or silver oak. All of those are fine. I most commonly call it the silk oak. This comes from Australia as well. It's not related to oak. It's not in the firewood family. This is actually in Proteaceae, which is a protea, which is a type of ornamental flower. They have a very unique color, this orange blossom that is filled with nectar. And right about now, they are flowering in San Diego. They'll flower for about a month. And when they are flowering, they're very noticeable. The rest of the year, you don't recognize them much at all. The nectar is very attracting to birds. Almost every migratory bird species will like to stop and sip the nectar from this tree. So if you are interested in giving food for the birds, you may consider having this tree. But pay attention to the image on the right-hand side. Notice how tall this tree gets. This is what we call a monumental scale tree, very large. And so we would recommend you plant it in a space that has plenty of room. You want to be able to view the tree from a distance in order to gain the best benefit. If you're just right underneath the tree, you don't really notice, and it grows so tall that it kind of grows past the scale of the landscape, especially in a residential setting. It will drop leaves and kind of create a lot of shade. So you may not want to put it in a small space, as the image shows, but it does bring a lot of benefits as well. There are some parts of our county where this can be a little bit invasive. It will readily sprout from seed. If you're east of the coast, we tend to get a little bit more rainfall there, and that's where they could become problematic, kind of in our foothill regions. Right on the coast, you're not going to have that issue. And when you get into the mountains, you probably won't have that issue. East of our foothills, La Mesa, El Cajon, Alpine, those neighborhoods are where you may want to limit this tree if you are next to an open space, because you will have some escaping of cultivation. Additionally, there is some caution to have with this tree because the sawdust, primarily, sometimes the leaves can cause contact dermatitis. So you can get a rash or a burning sensation on your skin. It's very rare to have that when you just touch the leaf. So most homeowners, most people who engage with this plant do not have a burning sensation. But the arborists, the people who trim these trees, when they use a chainsaw and cut through a branch, it spits out sawdust. That sawdust can be problematic. And again, not everyone has a reaction, but the reaction is more common with the sawdust than the leaves. And there are some arborists who just refuse to work with this tree. And this one as well is kind of a relic of a former time where it was introduced as an ornamental plant that was climate appropriate. But because of its invasiveness, because of its monumental scale, and because it has that potential to cause some injury, we don't recommend them too often these days. But when I see one, I still appreciate it. And in the right place at the right time, that monumental scale, if you have a lot of property and you have a room to fit one of these in, I think it may be worth the potential hazards as long as it can be in a design that does not encourage those hazards, because there is environmental benefit as well. And one way or the other, you will get questions every year this time. What is that orange tree that I see out there? So as a horticulturist, it's a good one to know about. Most of our grevilia species are shrubs, smaller plants that have a very beautiful flower. This is one of the few grevilias that grow as a tree that we plant in our area, and it's quite a unique specimen. So here we have Grevilia robusta, silk oak. And next up, we will leave Australia and head over to New Zealand. This is Metrosideros excelsa, the New Zealand Christmas tree. And it's called a Christmas tree, although it looks nothing like a pine tree. But it does have red flowers and a green foliage, that may give you some resemblance of Christmas. Like our eucalyptus, this is in the Myrtaceae family, the myrtle family. And this one is well behaved, no invasiveness, no fire risk. It is climate appropriate. It's a small growing tree, as you can see in the image on the lower right hand side. Although with time, it will grow to be about 35 to 40 feet tall, but it takes a long time to get there. If you plant these on the immediate coast, a place where there is very common marine layer, or you get the June gloom, you will tend to have aerial roots. And the image on the upper left shows those aerial roots in some detail. So coming from the branches, you will have roots growing down. That gives you kind of a tropical feel, maybe like a Hawaii type of a feel. There are, in fact, some Metrosideros plants that come from Hawaii as well. And the flower of this is obviously very attractive and beautiful. Looks kind of like some of the bottle brush or fairy duster type flowers we have, some of which we have covered. It's a tidy little tree that has a lot of environmental benefit and really no costs. So this is a great tree to recommend. It's good for urban areas, good for parking lots, landscapes, the medians of streets, sidewalks, great for patios, and all around a great specimen to include. Good for parks right on the coast because I particularly like to see those aerial roots. It's a unique characteristic. When you plant it a little bit inland, away from the coast, you don't get the aerial roots, but it still grows just fine. For example, at the Southwestern College campus, we do not get aerial roots, but we have very healthy and vigorous growth of Metrosideros excelsa. So here we have New Zealand Christmas tree, Metrosideros excelsa. And next up we have Pinus canariensis, the Canary Island pine. We've covered one pine so far. Previous to this, the Torrey pine. That's a native tree. And here is a tree that's native to a very similar climate, but a different location, the Canary Islands. Remember, the Torrey pine was a 5-needle pine. Well, the Canary Island pine is a 3-needle pine. Just like the Torrey pine, however, it has long needles, which is one of the ways to identify it. If it's got long needles, and there are 3 needles in a fascicle, very likely in San Diego, it's the Canary Island pine. This is probably the most common pine tree that is grown in San Diego. Very drought tolerant because the Canary Islands receive very little rainfall, just like San Diego. It is more dense than the Torrey pine, but can grow to be just as tall. It's a very large tree, as you can see with the residential scale on the image on the right-hand side. And another way to be certain that you are looking at a Canary Island pine is when you look on the image on the left, you will get what is called epicormic shoots. These are little branches that grow off of the trunk. So every year you'll see new growth growing off of the trunk, and that growth tends to be bluish in color. And if you see that, and you see 3 needles, and you see a very tall and conical shape, so a relatively narrow but tall columnar growth shape, you know you've got a Canary Island pine. And if you had to guess without even seeing it, you should guess Canary Island because it's the most common pine tree planted in San Diego. So it's a good one to recognize. I like to see some Canary Island pines mixed with some other pine species in order to kind of vary the landscape. In a functional as well as aesthetic design, it's good to incorporate pines on slopes. In nature, we tend to see them in the shallower soils, typically on the higher parts of a hill. So if you have a landscape with a slope and you want to include some pines as an evergreen or a windbreak or a shade providing species, you may consider putting these at the top of the slope or on the sides of the hill to mimic its natural condition for growing. At the base of the hill or the valley is where you would have more of the broadleaf trees, like oaks, for example, or some of the other trees that tend to grow well with deeper, more rich soil. So here we have Pinus canariensis, Canary Island pine. And next up we have Pinus pinea, the Italian stone pine. Stone pine is another common pine tree planted in San Diego. It comes from the Mediterranean region, so it is at home here. And it's one of the pine species that provide an edible nut. So when you purchase pine nuts from the store, you are purchasing from one of several species. The Italian stone pine is one of the ones that can provide an edible pine nut. Now, since we are looking at the needles in order to help us identify, this pine tree has 2 pine needles per fascicle. It's a 2-needle pine, and the needles themselves are shorter in length, not as long, maybe 4 to 8 inches as opposed to 8 to 12 inches. So if you see a 2-needle pine in San Diego, not always, but very likely, it is the Italian stone pine. Also, take a look at the overall shape of the canopy, as you can see on the image on the right-hand side, and notice how it has kind of an umbrella shape. You have a large trunk, very broad trunk and branches, with relatively little foliage, and then you get a very dense canopy on the top of the tree that provides a very deep shade. These can grow just fine right on the coast, and they go okay all throughout San Diego County. Primarily, I see them in established neighborhoods and more coastal than inland. An Italian stone pine forest is actually quite a unique environment to stroll through. You can imagine being in a shaded canopy with lots of broad branches overhead and relatively few trunks. So as a forest, I think these are a bit compelling. I would like to see several put together and makes a nice little forest walk or a place to sit and relax. Certainly a fun place to play as a kid. And these would make good trees to climb as well. They do need to be planted in an area where they can be allowed to spread because they are so broad. And as the image on the right-hand side shows, notice how they are creeping over the street and over the property. But so maybe they could look a little out of scale here, but it also provides kind of an interesting perspective and is probably a nice street to walk on and drive through. And so there may be some good uses there. They're fine all on their own too as a focal point or a monument. I do see them in established landscapes next to historic buildings, and they can be pruned and shaped so that their umbrella shape is accentuated, which is often something you want to do. So for all of these reasons, they're a valuable addition to the San Diego landscape. It's good to be able to identify, and we'll round out our study of pines with these 3. So here's our third one, the 2-needle pine. This is Pinus pinea, the Italian stone pine. And next up, we have Chinus mole, the California pepper. People pronounce this differently. Of course, Latin is no longer a spoken language, and botanical Latin is a written language. So there's no proper way to pronounce, as we've discussed. I hear people say shyness. I hear people say skyness. People say mole, moye, or mall. Skyness mall, shyness moye, however you want to pronounce it is fine. But you do need to remember how to spell it. One of the common names is California pepper because it's been planted in California for a very long time. It was introduced by the Spanish, and in California, this is associated with the Spanish missions. These are very broad trees with interesting bark and weeping branches. They're quite common in our landscape. Many people mistakenly think they are native to California, which they are not. They come from South America, in particular Peru. So some people are more strict. They want to remind everyone it's not a native tree, so they call it the Peruvian pepper, another common name. But I don't mind calling it the California pepper tree as long as you know it's not really from California. This one is a bit weedy, and so some people are inclined to remove it everywhere they see it. In fact, it has the designation of being naturalized, not invasive, but naturalized. And depending on who you talk to, some people may say that means that it exists in nature, it has not been planted by people, but it does not pose a problem to native species in general. That's kind of how we talk about the benign or the non-natives that are not a problem. They're naturalized. Notice the little berries. Those are not related to true peppercorns, but they can be eaten similarly to pepper. You do want to have some caution. Being in the Anacardiaceae family, the cashew family, also the mango and the poison oak family, they do have the potential to have some toxins, and some people may be more allergic than others. So if you're going to eat pink peppercorns, which you can eat, they are sold in grocery stores. You want to have some caution with it. Don't treat it the same as standard black pepper, which is not related to this plant at all. But it's kind of a gourmet, sort of a delicacy type of a herb and spice that is all around us in San Diego. With age, these trees develop a very gnarled trunk. So you can see the image on the right-hand side. This is a pepper tree in a park, and you can see it is starting to develop the gnarled trunk, which I think is very interesting and adds kind of a timelessness to a landscape when you see something that looks obviously so old. These are very climate appropriate. They grow with very little, if any, irrigation, and there will be some wildlife that is attracted to this plant. The leaf litter will suppress other plants from growing. It's difficult to get many things established under a pepper tree, but certainly it has a place in a California landscape, and not just in a historic context. They are still planted today. There's another pepper tree out there, the Brazilian pepper tree, which used to be planted in Southern California, but is much more highly invasive and for the most part has been eliminated. It's no longer sold. Many people have gotten the memo to remove those when they see them because they come up so easily. The California pepper is much more mild mannered in the landscape. And so there may always be a place for it in San Diego, although we wouldn't be planting it out in wildlands or in places where it has the chance to spread beyond cultivation. So here we have Shyness mole, the California pepper. And last but not least, we have Ulmus parvifolia, Chinese elm. Now, don't get this confused with the Australian willow, parviflora. This specific epithet is parvifolia. One's referencing the leaf, the other is referencing the flower. The Chinese elm is another traditional tree in the San Diego landscape. It has a very graceful branching structure and a weeping growth habit on its leaves. Its leaves are very characteristically alternately arranged. You only have one leaf exiting the stem at a time, although they tend to look like they could be bipinnate. But if you look closely, they are alternating. They're only on either side, though, on 180 degrees of each other, which is kind of a unique occurrence. The leaves are slightly serrate. There's some toothed edges on the leaves. And all in all, the tree itself has a very graceful structure, as you can see in the image on the right-hand side. It provides a dappled shade, so it lets sun pass through the canopy, and it can be pruned to enhance this characteristic. Oftentimes, the traditional way to prune this is what they call lacing out the tree. It's not really considered a proper practice anymore because you're removing too much growth and it creates weak branch structure. But for this tree in particular, it does tend to enhance that kind of graceful branching pattern when you lace out the tree and you allow more of the branches to become visible and all of the leaves then go to the outside of the canopy. In a residential landscape, they can form a very beautiful shade tree. In urban landscapes, you do see them in parking lots and in medians and in commercial landscapes where they can be quite hardy and they grow just fine. They're a medium water use tree, so they do require a little bit more water. And in times of drought, these will display some stress. And part of that stress comes from an insect infestation, a mealybug or a scale that is introduced typically with the Argentine ant. There are insects that will eat the sap of this plant, and when they eat that, they end up pooping out a sweet substance that is referred to as honeydew, and that is what the ants eat. So ants will actually introduce the pests to many different shrubs and trees. This is one of them, and they'll basically treat the sucking insects like cows, the way we treat cows. We don't eat grass, but cows eat grass, and then humans can drink the milk of the cows. Well, ants are doing the same thing with other insects that do eat plants. And so you may want to be watching out for ant trails going up and down this tree, in particular in times of drought, which will cause stress to the tree and weaken the tree's ability to resist pests that bite into it. Most often, though, they simply weaken it and make it look unsightly and have certain branches that die back. The ants are something that should be controlled if at all possible. There's many ways to do it, and unfortunately, ants are pretty good at figuring out how to get around your methods. And so you may need to try a variety of methods, always following integrated pest management approaches. The bark of this tree is ornamental as well. It's white in color, but with a slight mottled texture. So you can get grays in there and it ends up looking very nice. All around, just a very ornamental, classic landscape tree in San Diego. Maybe not one that's planted too often anymore because we need to be meeting drought restrictions, but I think it's very beautiful. And if you've got a medium water use hydrozone in your landscape, you may consider planting the Ulmus parvifolia Chinese elm because of its beautiful characteristics. So here we have Ulmus parvifolia Chinese elm. So there we go. There are the last 10 species we will cover. They are trees in the landscape. And as I said before, choosing what to cover is more an exercise in choosing what to leave out because there's so many more plants that we will not be able to cover this semester. But I hope that I've introduced some very important ones to you, some that are traditional in a landscaping sense, some that are cutting edge, that are good recommendations to be alternative plants that you should plant. And we try to cover a broad range of growth forms, trees, shrubs, vines, ground covers, a little bit of everything, so that you can begin to recognize these species as you go about your daily life. Once you recognize them, you can actually put them in context. Until you know their name, you almost don't see them. They're almost invisible. But once you can see them, just like reading the letters on a page, they actually start to tell you something and you'll recognize patterns. You'll recognize bloom times. You'll recognize positions in the landscape, parts of the county where they do well and where they don't do well. And this is just the beginning of an observational practice that you can maintain and carry with you. And it's kind of like a scavenger hunt that's going on right in front of everybody out in the open. And most people have no clue the depth of information, the variety, the diversity, the beauty of all of the plants that are in the San Diego landscape, native plants and climate appropriate introductions. I really hope you've enjoyed this class. I hope it gives you a greater appreciation for the plants in our landscape. And I hope that I've introduced some techniques and some tools along the way that you can carry with you so that this class is just the start of your appreciation for plants, their names, their history, their origins, their species, their uses, their interactions with each other in the landscape, and how humans can enhance the diversity on the planet by selecting the right plant for the right place at the right time, and hopefully have a net benefit in our world. As always, feel free to reach out to me in the Q&A discussion or in the Canvas inbox. And even after this class is over, please continue to stay in touch. And I would love to hear where this knowledge takes you. If you've got any key observations, questions, or new discoveries, I would love to learn about them. I hope you enjoyed all the plants we covered, as well as these final 10, and I wish you best of luck in your future endeavors. Take care.